Welcome to History, fourth grade. Yesterday, we read in Lesson 4 about immigration. Today, we're going to read about reform movements. What does reform mean? If you think reform means to make changes, you are absolutely correct. So, today's reading is about movements or groups that wanted to make changes in our country, specifically in the Northeast region. Let's read together Reform Movements on page 98. As the country grew, people wanted to improve society. They looked at conditions that were unjust, meaning unfair, and began to work for change. They looked at the working conditions or the atmosphere when people went to work. Let's read that. An obvious area for improvement was the conditions for workers. Reformers, those people that wanted to make changes, reformers tried to help increase pay, reduce hours, and improve working conditions, especially in factories. Remember the story we read the other day about the 10-year-old boy working in a factory, sometimes for as long as 16 hours? Let's continue reading. A fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in 1911 killed 146 workers. This tragedy brought attention to the dangerous conditions in factories. Lawmakers passed a series of laws to better protect the safety of workers. In addition, labor unions, unions were groups that tried to work together to get better conditions and better pay. So, labor unions were formed to protect workers' rights. You've heard me talk about the Underground Railroad. Let's read about that. In the 1800s, slavery was an issue that divided the United States. People in the South used enslaved Africans to work their fields and homes. The work was hard. Some people in the North thought slavery was wrong and began working to end it. This movement was called the abolitionist movement. An abolitionist is someone who wants to abolish or end slavery. One way abolitionists took action was to create a secret route to help enslaved people escape to the north. The Underground Railroad was a series of stops where the escaping people could rest before continuing farther north, often to Canada. The Northeast had many stops on the Underground Railroad. Abolitionists also gave moving speeches. Sojourner Truth, a former enslaved person, was an abolitionist. She also believed that women should have the same rights as men. She traveled the country speaking on the issues of slavery and women's rights. In 1851, she gave a powerful speech about women's rights, now called Ain't I a Woman? Remember another famous abolitionist that we talked about back in February in the classroom? She was a former slave as well. Do you remember Harriet Tubman and how she worked with the Underground Railroad? Continuing our reading on page 99, there's a section there, a primary source. Remember, a primary source is an original source. So, Sojourner Truth wrote this, and so this is a primary source. Her very own words say, "Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman?" So she did some writing, and we are pulling her words out She is saying she worked just as hard as a man. Just as hard as a man, doesn't she deserve the chance to vote and have the same rights as men? Women's voting rights. For the early part of American history, only white men who owned property could vote in elections. Some women thought that everyone should have the right to vote. This movement was called the women's suffrage movement. Suffrage is the right to vote in political elections. The movement first began in the 1820s. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott held a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. They discussed how women deserved the same rights as men. 72 years later, women finally won the right to vote all across the nation with the 19th Amendment. Let's look at the stop and check. They asked the question, why do you think people in the Northeast started these reform movements? Why do you think these movements or these groups to change things started? Why did this start in the Northeast? Think about how the Northeast was part of the original 13 colonies. Think about how the Northeast fought against slavery. Think about the women and the people, the immigrants that had come to live in the Northeast, and the fact that they wanted rights, they wanted better conditions to work in. Think about and answer the question, why do you think people in the Northeast started these reform movements? Boys and girls, that's all for today. If you have any questions, email me. Bye.